How oft shall my brother sin against me, and I forgive him? Till 7 times?
In the verses preceding our lesson, Jesus is explaining how church members should deal with someone who has sinned against another, especially how to deal with someone who despises another brother. All of this prompts Peter to come to Jesus and ask, how many times must one forgive another brother? Peter suggests 7 times. In his question, Peter was seeming to be very forgiving. Jewish teachers, rabbis, taught that forgiving someone more than 3 times was unnecessary. And so, offering forgiveness that more than doubled Jewish tradition, Peter was expecting a commendation. You have to remember that although they had been with Jesus for some time, they were still thinking in the limited terms of Jewish law rather than the unlimited terms of grace. Jesus' response, 70 times 7, is far beyond what Peter proposed and frankly stuns the listening disciples. Jesus was not limiting forgiveness to 490 times. He is saying to us as modern Christians that we must have a forgiving heart, continuing to forgive with as much grace the 1000th time as we do the first time. This is not our natural tendency. So Christians are only capable of this kind of forgiveness if we have the Spirit of God living within us and controlling us. In Matthew 6, when he was teaching his disciples how to pray, he explained the importance of forgiveness as an essential part of our faith. Directly after his 70 times 7 speech, Jesus tells of the parable of the unforgiving servant to illustrate that if we are forgiven our enormous debts of sin against God, how much more should we be eager to forgive those who have sinned against us? The parable goes that the first servant could not pay the enormous debt. He owed 10,000 talents. That's over $1 million. The king had the right to sell him into servitude and his family. The poor wretch threw himself at the king's feet and begged. And touched by his plea, the king let him off and erased the debt. Now this first servant, who had just been forgiven, came out of the house and met a second servant who owed him 100 denarii. Now 100 denarii was about a day's worth of wages, about 16 cents. He demanded his money of the second servant, and the second servant threw himself to the ground and began to beg, just as the first servant had just done to the king for his much larger debt. The first servant, unforgiving and unwilling to forgive the second servant that smaller sum of money, and so he cast the debtor into prison. The other servants saw this, and they were outraged, and they reported to the king who had forgiven the first servant what that servant had done. The king was furious, saying he had forgiven the first servant his entire debt when he begged him for mercy. Shouldn't he have been compelled to show mercy on his fellow servant, that second servant, rather than casting him in jail? And with that, the king cast the first servant in jail for his enormous debt. The principle here is that one forgiven much should forgive much. The principle of forgiveness is that of grace. In essence, forgiveness is unmerited and unlimited. The disciples and we are not to count the number of times we forgive, just as the measureless grace of God is poured out on us. This concept of forgiveness is why I often say that Christianity is a radical faith, for it requires an inner spirit to control our natural human tendencies. Our faith calls upon us to forgive the words that still ring in our ears, spoken by lips we still love. To forgive for deeds committed with an evil heart by selfish hands of one we once called friends. To forgive for stomping on our hearts, walking away, declaring never to return just before they prodigally knock on our door again. Forgiveness is not merely a word, I forgive. Forgiveness erases the debt so that the debtor does not owe, and we should not want or expect any more repayment. For modern Christians, you have to ask yourself, what is forgiveness? What does it look like in our daily life? Forgiveness means resisting the impulse for revenge, not returning evil for evil, not returning memes for memes. Forgiveness means wishing those who aggrieved you well, grieving at their calamities instead of rejoicing quietly in your mind when they have fallen, thinking you have seen payback. Forgiveness is sincerely praying for their welfare and seeking reconciliation to the extent that you can. Forgiveness is coming to their aid in their hour of distress. I know that is radical. I know that requires the Holy Spirit, and I know that is my Christian duty. That's the lesson for this week. Have a great week. Bye.